Yeah, so welcome to the old Battlestar Galactica versus new Battlestar Galactica Part 2. Last time I left off, it was, I talked about how in the original they had ray guns and they had a higher level of medicine, and how in some ways, the lopsided technological development portrayed in the new Battlestar Galactica seemed to make it unrealistic, because much of society, like on Caprica, very much like Earth, much of their society seemed very similar, technologically very similar, culturally very similar to what you have in on Earth society, except the fact that they have extremely advanced artificial intelligence whom rebelled against them, and also the fact that they do have interstellar space capability. So in regards to that, I mean, on one hand, this very high level of technological development, and on the other hand, this relatively low level primitive technological development, which I thought was made the series, made the show, much less believable in that sense. But it's almost like you hear about alien abductions sometimes. People, they claim to have had surgeries performed on them, and they describe some of the implements used, which sound almost like medieval implements. That one would think that if a civilization can travel vast distances through interstellar space, or maybe even intergalactic space, that they would have better surgical tools, unless of course they're extremely sadistic and they choose to be that, and that's a possibility, which would also go back to the problem of having very primitive sociological technology, which runs their society. That's a possibility. I mean, it's like when you watch Star Trek Discovery. There was one episode where one of the Klingons gets injured, has this big scar on her face, and I'm thinking to myself, well, the Klingons, they probably have the same level of technology as the Federation. You would think that they would have the capability to fix your scar, unless the Klingon culture consider scars and gouged eyes and partial amputations to be a badge of honor, or something ridiculous like that. Which again would go back to the fact that they're the cultural technology or the sociological technology would be lagging behind. When you talk about the Klingons, I mean, again, this is some of the things that make Star Trek, or at least the Klingons, not very believable, is that they seem to be run by a bunch of drunken space Vikings, the Klingon Empire, whom don't seem capable of creating warp drive and all the technology comparable to what Starfleet has. And so it kind of makes you wonder if there's some kind of underclass of Klingons, the minority of Klingons, which are intellectual eggheads, but they're not the tough guys within the Klingon society. The majority of the Klingons would be the tough guys, the headbangers, the people that like to bang heads and think it's just dandy to die in battle, right? Yeah. So, anyways, I suppose there's precedence in lopsided technological development, as seen in real life. So I guess in that sense, I guess it's a bit of a stretch. It's a bit of reaching, but I suppose it can be believable, you know. But I just kind of thought that it was slightly less believable than it could be. You know, and another thing too, which I thought was disappointing about the new Battlestar was there was no mention of aliens, no mention of ET. Like in the original, there were many alien races, and in fact, the Cylons were actually an alien race. I think they were. I think they were like a reptilian race, and then the robots, the Centurions. You know, they were the guys that did all the heavy lifting, the killing. You know, by your command. You know, they were the guys that did all the killing and all the hard stuff. And so they switched it up a little bit with the new one. And since there's no mention of ETs in the new Battlestar Galactica, it kind of made that universe a little bit smaller, a little bit less interesting. You know, I just thought that it was, a bit disappointing. And, you know, I think the original Battlestar was more of a true science fiction show. I mean, the Battlestar 1980, which had talked a little. They had a couple of episodes dealing with time travel. They had one episode or a couple of episodes, I think, where they actually built a flying saucer, a anti-gravity, some exotic propulsion. Which is would be more of a staple of science fiction. You know, something that's non-Newtonian, that's not a Newtonian machine, that doesn't operate on mass ejection propulsion or matter ejection propulsion, action reaction. And of course, they also had like the Vipers on both shows. The Vipers, Raptors, Raiders, they all operate on action reaction propulsion. So one would think that the rocket fuel would not be what they use today in real life. It wouldn't be hydrogen or kerosene, or it would have to be something else, something more efficient, more powerful than hydrogen, and denser, and yet, by some magical property, lighter than kerosene, and it would take up very little space, because when you look at the Vipers, they're not very big. So it's probably lightweight, and you don't need much of it, and it can really go far. And so I would imagine it's probably not some kind of petroleum-based propellant. It would have to be something else. And yet in the new Battlestar Galactica, they had, I think it was during the later episodes where they showed, Dr. Boltar. He's riding this was before he betrayed, or I guess this was before the Cylons attacked, where they had, he's driving around. He's riding around in a limo, and he's being seduced by the Cylon, and so he's riding around in a limo, and I would assume that that's a internal combustion engine, right? So they don't even have electric cars, right? Or they don't have, levitating cars, or they don't have anything like that. All they have is internal combustion vehicles, which I would assume runs on some kind of petroleum-based energy source, and yet they have these Vipers, which are Newtonian, but somehow they can lift off the surface of an Earth-like planet or Caprica, and in one stage, and have plenty of energy to spare. So I would assume, it would have to be something different. It would not be cultivated from the same source as what they use to ride around in their cars in. And so there's of course the writers of the show, they're trying to tell a story, they're trying to expedite a narrative they're not concerned with bolt by bolt detail of all these things. So they're not going to talk much about it. But I thought it made it less, made it less believable in that sense. But yeah, with that said, I mean, there were certain things about the new Battlestar that were far better than the old one. I mean, I think the most obvious thing, I mean, visually, it had better special effects, right? It had better, I mean, the CGI. I mean, the Centurions were much better. Instead of having guys dress up in metal suits and walking around clumsily, they actually made it look pretty good. And so visually, I mean, both shows were packed with action, mini space battles. But the newer show, I mean, was definitely a lot deeper. It had this depth to it. The characters were much deeper in the new show. There was a lot more character development. There was a lot more, it was deeper philosophically, emotionally, psychologically. It was a much deeper show. One of the best episodes is the one where Dean Stockwell, he played Cavall, who was one of the hardcore human-hating Cylons, and he went on this rant, this diatribe against being stuck in a human form, and how he was not capable of fully appreciating the witnessing of a supernova. He could only see part of the spectrum. He was not capable of seeing the entire spectrum. He could only see the visual light. He couldn't see infrared or ultraviolet or anything else. And how being imprisoned, in fact, in a human form, having his potential, his consciousness as a machine amputated and then straitjacketed into this box of a human form, it robbed him of that potential, of that wide, vast expanse of consciousness that he otherwise would have had if he had remained a machine. And even the way that he expressed himself, everything had to be expressed through a very clumsy, audible, linguistic language, as opposed to almost the equivalent of a telepathy. I would imagine that the Cylons had. I mean, everything had to be expressed in this very clumsy, cumbersome human language, and much of that robbed him of his, it amputated his consciousness to a great degree and his potential. And it was a very deep philosophical stuff that, that the original never came near to approaching. I mean, I think a lot of the characters in the original were pretty shallow. I mean, there was not a lot of development. You kind of got the sense that in the original, everything was, was done in one take, as opposed to, I mean, there was no real depth of character. And so, I mean, the new one was better, vastly better in that regard. And I suppose it maybe because it wasn't science fiction for the sake of science fiction, that it was actually more of a human drama encased in the veneer of science fiction as a vehicle to tell the stories. And so in that regard, the new one was many times better than the original. So, I mean, but ultimately it's all a matter of opinion. It's a very subjective thing. I mean, I happen to enjoy both. I thought they were both very entertaining shows. Both entertaining and very thought-provoking. Well, especially the new one was more thought-provoking in the sense of being a human drama. But they were both, very entertaining, well done, thought-provoking shows and great science fiction, great human drama. So, yeah, so they're both, highly enjoyable shows.